All right, welcome to episode number 19 of the Oklahoma Weather Show. We are now in the middle of May 2014. It's a gorgeous day outside. I thought about having this show outside, but we continue our weekly podcast here, and a great guest that we have on the show today, Dr. Harold Brooks from down here in Norman. He is a senior research scientist at NSSL, and again, a lot of times when you hear some type of amazing facts coming out about tornadoes and surviving tornadoes. They're really coming from Harold and his team of scientists down there in Norman. Meteorologist Danielle Dozier was in charge of getting this show put together today, and she has a number of questions. Great questions, so Danielle, take it away.
Well, first off, Harold, thanks for joining us, and we're really excited to have you here on the Oklahoma Weather Show. You know, we're gonna talk a lot on the discussion and the topic on tornado survivability and the importance of knowing and letting everyone know that you can survive. You focus a lot on EF4s and EF5s. You can survive those type tornadoes above ground. So we'll first start with, we have a holistic questions. Number one, which is, you know, you've done a lot of research, and we know it's been a somewhat slow season for us in Oklahoma. Oklahoma, for everyone out there listening, averages about 22 tornadoes in May. Last year we had a total of 63 in the month. And now, from what I believe, I think it's only been one. So what do you think, in your expert opinion, is leading to this somewhat slower season for us?
Well, it's you know the answer is kind of a pat answer, but the pattern hasn't been very favorable for tornadoes. We just haven't had when we've had good wind shear. That's one of the ingredients we look for. We haven't had the moisture or the instability aloft. We just haven't had a favorable pattern for setting up for tornadoes. We've had a couple of days that have been close. That we might have gotten a little bit more out of it than we did, but really just the pattern hasn't been very good most of the year.
I think a lot of people maybe look back to the past few weeks where we've had all these risk days, and I'm getting a little bit off the question list here, but we've had a lot of these risk days, and they just really haven't amounted to too much. We had the tornado watch, Northwest Oklahoma, didn't really see anything. We had, a slight risk for the metro. Kind of talk a little bit, I think, about that, because I think a lot of people are, I guess I don't want people to become complacent. They see all these risk maps, we tell them there's a chance, and then it doesn't happen for the metro. Kind of talk a little bit about that.
Well, a couple of things that are really important to remember. When the Storm Prediction Center puts out a convective risk of any kind, slight, moderate, or high risk, you have to remember, first of all, that it's not always tornadoes. So a lot of times that the real risk is associated with hail or wind, and that we tend to, as humans, I think we tend to focus more often on the tornado and think that when they put a risk out, they're being tornado. But if you read what they've written, a lot of times that's not really what goes on. And it's also important to remember that in severe weather events, it's frequently a very fine line between nothing at all, I mean, not even thunderstorms, and tornadoes occurring, and violent tornadoes occurring. And so that the chances of being off are always going to be there, and that in some sense, if you're a forecaster, the penalty you pay for missing an event is a whole lot higher than the penalty you pay for over forecasting or for a false alarm. And the same thing happens with a human being. If you're trying to protect yourself, well, if you make a mistake in protecting yourself, you're going to pay a big price. Whereas if you take a little bit extra caution, well, you lost a little bit of time maybe, and that's pretty simple.
Right. And we hear a lot of, it's been such a slow season. Doesn't necessarily mean that. And you've done a lot of research. I mean, are there any other times or years you can think of similar to maybe last year where it's been relatively quiet, and then all of a sudden at the end of May or even June we start to see these terrible storms?
Well, if we look historically, and I tend to look nationally at information, we see some years where we've had really slow starts. In particular, in recent years, May of 2003. When we look back at 2003, we were actually near the low end of tornado counts that we'd ever seen through April the 29th of 2003, and by the 10th of May, we were actually above average for tornadoes nationally. So it was a huge first 10 days of May that year. And 1992, we were well below normal until the middle of June, and then in June there was a week again that was very, very active and got us up back above normal. What we see historically is that what's happened if you start January 1st to any day of the year, what's happened previously tells us virtually nothing about what's going to happen the rest of the year. We've had slow years that have stayed slow. 1987 comes to mind. We've had slow years that have gotten big. 2003, 1992, and then we've had big years that have big starts to years that have essentially shut down. 2012 was one of those, and then other years where it stayed big the whole way through. The basis schedule that's 1957.
Very interesting. And a lot of people question winter season and maybe early spring and kind of talk about is there any sort of correlation? Is it we had a cold winter? Does this mean we're going to have a crazy tornado season or vice versa? What have you known in situations like this with the weather patterns and such?
What we found is that there was actually a project done as one of the summer students working on a research experience for undergraduates program here at the National Weather Center last year. They did a project with forecasters from the local forecast office, and they worked awfully hard and couldn't find anything really between the winter season, what happened in the winter, and what happened later in the year. There's been a little bit of suggestion that perhaps some patterns that we can see in the Pacific Ocean in February tells us something about what happens in the spring, but that's essentially, it's really counting mostly on persistence, that what we're seeing in the Pacific in February continues on, which to the extent that this is the first year that research can be tested, and I don't remember them actually making a forecast for what the spring would look like to allow us to actually look at what the results would be.
Very cool. Like, when Damon can probably vouch for this, that we've been here long enough, and even Jonathan and probably even Brad as well, that June seems to be the month where we see these. It kind of goes from not so much of a tornado threat to we get these storm complexes that are overnight storm complexes. What kind of setup? What's a reasoning for this in your eyes that you've seen over the years?
Well, there are two big things that happen. One of them is that the wind shear that helps organize storms into isolated storms that we'll see in the April and May kind of time frame, the wind shear starts to drop off some, and so that the isolation gets a little bit. The other thing that happens is actually what happens in terms of thunderstorms in the Front Range of Colorado in particular. They don't start really firing thunderstorms there until the middle of May or early June. And what happens when those storms form over the eastern part of the Rockies or over the foothills east of the Rockies, essentially they start forming mid to late afternoon, and then as they get organized as they go along overnight and they grow up to larger scale, we see the impacts of those complexes overnight. And that's actually even a bigger factor when you go further north than here. If you go to a place like Omaha, Nebraska, they're actually in the summertime, their maximum precip is in the middle of the night. And it's essentially all of these groups of thunderstorms that come together and merge into a larger body. Typically not real severe, but very heavy rainfall. And they come out, when you get out to where we live, they'll be here in the middle of the night.
Yeah. And guys, I'm going to go through these questions, and we're going to get to the bigger part of the topic here in a second, and then probably open up the conversation a little more. So talk a little bit about, you kind of addressed it at the beginning, the fact that when the SPC issues these risks, that it's not just for tornadoes, and we try to talk a lot here that hey, it's a damaging wind threat, winds over 60 miles per hour and such. Explain to people at home listening that yes, it's not that winds can do just as much damage as the tornado. And if you have any examples from years past, go ahead and talk about that as well.
Well, by definition, a severe thunderstorm in the United States produces either a tornado, winds in excess of 50 knots, which is 58 miles an hour, or hail of at least 1 inch in diameter. And obviously, they can go up higher than that. And those are the things that the Storm Prediction Center is primarily forecasting for. When we see really high-end wind events, straight-line wind events that are non-tornadic, what we typically see is that the peak winds may not be quite as strong as they are in the tornado winds, but that they'll cover a broader area, and so they produce a different kind of a problem. Recently, back in the early mid-1990s, there was a storm that came through Lahoma, Oklahoma, that was a non-tornadic. It was a supercell, but it was non-tornadic and produced a swath of high winds, perhaps almost 10 miles wide, with softball-sized hail, and the winds were blowing close to 100 miles an hour. Now, in 100 miles an hour, in the case of a tornado, isn't a real strong tornado, but when it's over a broad area, you essentially knock down all of the power poles over several miles wide. It can cause real problems. And we've seen things like that go through the metropolitan area in the past. And there have been other places. In northern Kansas, there was a classic storm back in the mid-1990s where all of the power lines over a 15-mile wide were knocked down. And it just takes a long time to recover from that. It almost looks like what you see with damage with a hurricane. The peak damage isn't all that bad, but a lot of infrastructure gets damaged badly enough that you can't just walk out of the path. It takes a long time to get out of it.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we're having the conversation just so that people at home know that, when you hear there is a damaging wind threat, to take it seriously. We're not just saying it just to say it. I mean, those type of winds can induce some heavy damage to people's property and such.
Your property doesn't really care whether the winds that hit it are from a tornado or from a straight line winds. And in fact, on the scale of your house, it can't tell the difference between the two because the winds are essentially straight when it hits a tornado or a small structure. And so if you get hit by extremely high winds, straight line winds, it'll do the same thing as a tornado of the same magnitude. And sometimes we find events where with the wind threat that the winds last for a long time. In the Concordia, Kansas event that I was mentioning a few minutes ago, the winds were over severe limits, so over 50 knots, 58 miles an hour, for about 30 minutes. And that's a really long time to if you think about it, when it's gusty, normally you kind of think, the winds last for a minute or two and then they die down. Well, you start having severe level winds for 30 minutes, lots of things that would survive the first minute start to fall apart.
Right, and we had a similar situation to this, I think it was last week, when we had the storm damage in Gracemont, because there were strong winds coming into there. So it's another example.
Right, and so you see these things, and it just, if you're exposed to winds for a few seconds, that's one thing. If you're exposed to any kind of pretty high winds for 30 minutes, that could be a really bad thing. And the same thing with hail. If the hail lasts for several minutes, you might get lucky on the first few stones, and then eventually you're going to get hit by something.
Right, and there's other phenomena. Talked about straight line winds, microbursts, downbursts, heat bursts. They're a little more rare, but they can happen, and also create some very strong winds. So let's move on to the more meat and potatoes of the topic now, which is obviously the safe rooms, either above or below ground, and also tornado survivability. Not only from EF0, EF1, but also EF4s and EF5s. So in particular, we'll start with the EF5 tornado that we're all familiar with. We're coming up on the year anniversary of the Moore tornado, Newcastle Moore and such. There's a lot of talk about you can't survive an EF4, EF5, a tornado of this magnitude above ground. Just address that, because you've done so much research on this topic.
And I'll be really honest, I haven't individually done most of the research, but I'm familiar with everybody who has done it.
Right. You're aware.
Studies, and in particular, the Oklahoma State Department of Health has done a couple of major studies after 1999 and after last year, and then a group from Kent State University in Ohio also looked at the May 3rd, 1999 tornado. And what we found is that for people who were inside of houses that were rated EF4 and EF5, and we know that they were in the houses because they've been asked or their relatives were asked where they were at the time the tornado hit it and they got the damage, approximately 1 to 2% of those people are killed by tornadoes. So your chances of survival, and these are not people who didn't have special safe rooms, these were people who just had their ordinary house available to them. Now, your chances of being killed if you're in a mobile home, we have to remember always, go up a lot higher. That's about 15 to 20 times as likely. And so at that point, that's the one exception to the you can survive above ground rule is that mobile homes, when it's with a violent tornado, EF4, EF5, your chances of survival at that point become close to 50-50, and those aren't real good odds. Now, but what we've seen, there have been studies done after the Birmingham 1998 tornado, which was an EF5 tornado, May 3rd, 99 Oklahoma City Moore tornado, tornado in 2003 that hit Moore, the Tuscaloosa tornado in 2011, and Joplin in 2011, and then the May 20th tornado last year. All of them come up with the same answer: 1 to 2% of people who are inside of homes that don't have a special safe room, and those houses sustain EF4, EF5 damage. 1 to 2% of those occupants are killed. So our basic message is always, in the tornado threat, you need to take action. And you need to take the action to get as low as you can and put as many walls between you and the tornado as possible. It's better if you improve, but if you don't have one yet, then you should be thinking about what to do.
Yeah, and we have had instances. I think I just completely lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I had something in mind and then I lost it. You know, I think telling people that they should be below ground is something that we're trying to kind of not necessarily go away from, but add to, you know, like, hey, make sure that you're in your closet, interior-most room. We've had circumstances where there was a family in the Moore tornado that survived above ground in their bathtub. So the situation in Arkansas, I'll just address that one. It was in Valonia, the EF4. So a lot of social media talk about this particular tornado, and this person was killed in their safe room, their above ground safe room in this. For people who aren't aware of the situation, they came to find out that it was built by the person. It was not built by under FEMA guidelines. So talk about the importance of making sure that, you know, whatever you have is obviously a safe room.
Well, the case of Bologna, from the pictures that we've seen, and the family has not really allowed a serious inspection of it, but the safe room, the pictures that have taken of that room, and I really don't want to call it a safe room, whereas that they didn't use a door that's approved for this kind of shelter. They used it appears to be an ordinary metal door. The way that the door failed, and some of the pictures of it, it clearly was not a heavy steel door, which is what's recommended for these kinds of things. The thing that people need to be aware of is there's a document that FEMA has put out, FEMA 320. It's called Taking Shelter from the Storm, that gives you the plans, gives you the specifications for what you should build. If it's above ground, you want reinforced concrete with the reinforcing bars every 6 inches, covering essentially a cage around the entire room. You want a heavy steel door with 3 locks and 3 hinges, so there's 6 points of attachment for that door to the frame. And I can speak from personal experience that when we put one into our house in 2004, I believe it was, when we did an addition onto the house, and we handed the FEMA document to our architect and the contractor. Neither one of them had built a safe room before, but that the plans are so clear, it was very easy for them to build that. And our door meets the specifications, our structure meets the specifications. I'm quite confident that ours will survive anything that Mother Nature can throw at it.
Yeah, I remember what I was going to say. I was going to reference the May 19th Shawnee Dale Bethel Acres tornado and how people were killed in their mobile homes, because we were talking about mobile homes. You know, I think it's important for people to realize, obviously, those are just not safe whatsoever. I think people get the idea that they can, if they're tied down or whatnot, or they're strapped down, that they're fine. And I don't think that that's necessarily true.
Right now, half of all deaths that occur in tornadoes occur in mobile homes.
Did you say half?
Half of all deaths that occur in tornadoes in the United States are in mobile homes, and your risk of being killed is about 15 to 20 times what it is in a permanent home.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm gonna get this out. I'm trying to do a little social media at the same time I'm listening to you. You know, a lot of. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, Dr. Brooks, Jonathan Condra here. I do have a question for you. You talk about the survival rate in a home, which is very high. What's the survival rate if you're in your car? So can we compare the two, let's say apples to apples, survival rate?
That's a lot harder to tell on the car. The data, just especially for the violent tornadoes, the data just really haven't been collected. It's a lot harder to tell when we try to go back and look at things, exactly what was happening with the tornado when that car was hit. Since cars are mobile, there's that question about, was this in the EF5, EF4, EF3, EF2 winds? And so we really don't have the numbers that are equivalent. It would be really great to have them, but to my knowledge, no one has ever actually been able to put that together. On average, it's about, I think, 1/7 of all tornado deaths occur in vehicles. But it's really hard to tell what the baseline exposure is as something. But one of the things that's important to remember is if you get in your car and try to flee, especially if you're fleeing in the last few minutes before the tornado occurs, or before the tornado gets to where you are, that there's a heck of a lot of other stuff that can happen. If you just imagine if you commute from Norman or Edmond into Oklahoma City, you know what traffic's like in the late afternoon on a normal day. All it takes is, one person does something, wrong, and you got an accident, and all of a sudden, instead of that 20-minute drive just became a 45, 50-minute drive, and you're stuck in the middle with a tornado approaching. That's, if one of the things I tell people is if you're the only person who tries to evacuate, you probably got a shot at it. But if 100,000 of your closest friends all leave at the same time, you've got a big problem.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of talk amongst the communities that are being hit by these storms, and the fact that these meteorologists are not rating these tornadoes high enough. Another example would be May 31st of last year in EF3. People thought it should be EF5. We could talk about that forever. We've already done that. We don't really need to do that. But there was also, more recently, the tornado in Arkansas, in Valonia, I think it was the Mayflower, Valonia. Either way, people there, it was rated an EF4. People say they're concrete slabs. There's vehicles tossed on homes, and why is it not an EF5? I think people, and I would like you to talk about the importance of and what is exactly the enhanced Fujita scale, and the fact that, from what I understand, vehicles aren't really a part of that scale in the determination of the overall damage.
The enhanced Fujita scale came into use in the National Weather Service to rate tornadoes starting in 2007, and it consists of a series of 28 damage indicators. So things that we can define: an ordinary house, the awning in front of a gas station, hospitals, schools. There are different kinds of structures, and depending upon the degree of damage, there are, based on expert solicitation and expert opinion, there are wind speeds associated with all of those degrees of damage, with all of those kinds of structures, modified by, was this structure better built than the average structure, or more poorly built than the structure. And what happened in Arkansas is that none of the communities that were hit by the tornado had adopted the state building code, and so essentially none of the structures that were hit were particularly well built by the standards that we put in with the enhanced Fujita scale. Even a newly built structure, unless the homeowner had done something above and beyond what was required by code, it wouldn't classify as a well-built structure. So that's really what happened with the Mayflower Valonia tornado. And cars are not included in the EF scale. They were included. Cars getting thrown were included in the original F scale, the Fujita scale that Ted Fujita put together back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. But as we've gone on in time, we realized that cars are really complicated. There are times in which we've seen parking lots get hit. There was a tornado in Alabama about 5 years ago, where with surveillance footage, and there are two cars that appear to be identical, parked next to each other, and they're clearly inside of the relatively high winds of this storm. One of them gets flipped over, the other one is about 2 inches. And what in the world happens over that 6 feet period space, or what is hard to tell. I mean, at one level, cars, if you can start to get them airborne, they're intended to have, modern vehicles are intended to have the air flow over them and be aerodynamic. So if you can get the car up off the ground a little bit, it's supposed to fly at one level, except the fact that it's heavy. And so cars are really complicated, and I think more complicated than we've given them credit for years ago.
Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Sorry.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to jump in because it's
Yeah.
Harold. This is Damon here behind the little face here. I'm not gonna be able to turn on my webcam, but you talk about cars, and one thing that I get a lot from school children, the question whenever we go and talk to schools, is what do you do if there's a tornado coming and you're in your car? A while back, we used to push out the whole get out of your car, go into a ditch, and then somewhere around the 2007, 2008 timeframe, I started hearing some different messaging saying, well, stay in your car and get below the glass window level.
Yeah.
And then they said, well, if the airbag deploys, then people were getting hit as they were crouched below the window. So then they said, don't do that. So where are we now with car safety and tornadoes coming in? What should we be saying so that we're all on the same page?
Sure. Well, I think the number one message is if you're in a position where you're in your car and you're choosing between riding out a tornado in your car or getting out and getting into the ditch, you've already made the big mistake. You shouldn't have been there. And I think that's one of the bottom line messages. And what I tell people is that I certainly don't expect anybody, and I don't do this, to be monitoring the weather 24 hours a day. But we know enough now that there are very few big tornado days that occur that we don't have a pretty good idea that morning that there's at least a threat, say, for central Oklahoma or the western two-thirds of Oklahoma. And at that point, I start monitoring their behavior just to be weather aware on that day. And okay, I wasn't going to drive up towards Oklahoma City for parking that afternoon just because I was aware there was a possible threat. I was going to keep myself out of the position to where I had to make a choice between bad options. Right now, I still think that perhaps what you really want to do is you want to get your car and get to a sturdy structure. You get off the highway, get to a fast food place, get to a bank, get to some place that has that will put walls between you and the tornado. If you have to choose between a ditch and riding it out, you're not in a real good place in the best of options.
That's a good point. And I'm going to I have a question here. It's a little bit severe weather talk, a little bit of climatology talk, and we'll have Gary on in a couple weeks talking about the state of the climatology, the state of our weather here in Oklahoma. But how bad does Oklahoma need severe weather in order to stay out of a drought? Have you noticed that this state needs severe weather to produce a lot of drinking water, or do you think that we can get out of this drought that we're in right now without severe weather?
Well, severe is perhaps, we don't necessarily have to have severe, but we need thunderstorms. And it's pretty hard to get thunderstorms most of the time in Oklahoma, certainly in the springtime, without it being severe weather. If you actually, if you look over a larger scale, you look in the central part of the U.S. and central Canada, what you actually find is that people tend to live near where there's severe weather. And that goes back to the fact that severe weather is associated with thunderstorms, that's associated with rain. In the central U.S., the spring and summertime growing season, about half of the rain that falls comes out of thunderstorms. And so we pay that price for the fact that if we're gonna get a lot of rain, it typically comes out of thunderstorms, and it's very hard to avoid having severe weather with thunderstorms in this part of the world. So I think that's essentially what's going to happen. I mean, our only other option, and this option wouldn't come in until much later in the year, is to get dying tropical cyclones to come up and give a lot of rain. But it's not a good situation right now in western Oklahoma, and there's really not much way we're going to get rain in the spring without having had severe thunderstorms.
Yeah, this has
2007.
Yeah, no kidding. This has been a pretty tough year. I know a lot of us, especially after last year, saying just how bad we needed to get out of the drought. We got out of last year's drought pretty quickly, now it's back, but you get to the point now where you kind of have to be a little careful, with what you wish for, because if you wish for a lot of rain, I especially last year, May 20th, and I don't remember the exact stats on May 20th, but I believe Will Rogers World Airport it was a crazy amount of rainfall, and it kind of got lost in the entire afternoon on just how much rain we had picked up that day. But I want to say it was in like the 4 to 5 inch range. But again, it just got lost in translation with what was happening that afternoon.
Over the short term, the highest rainfall rates that are certainly seen outside of the tropics on the planet are associated with supercell thunderstorms. If you look on a 5 or 6 minute time frame, it's equivalent to 8 inches per hour of rainfall. So if you have a very slowly moving supercell, you can pick up a lot of rain in a very short period of time. There's a famous storm out in Canyon, Texas, where that was moving less than 5 miles an hour, and in the course of a little over 2 hours, they got roughly 10 inches of rain in Canyon. And the severe threat may not have been that high, but the flooding threat was awfully high that day, and it was literally sheet flooding going through the Paladero Canyon. And so that's, supercells are really good at making prodigious rain rates as well as tornadoes and hail and high winds.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I think a lot of people tend to look at severe weather as just tornadoes. A question that I have to ask, and we started talking about this a couple months ago with just a couple friends of mine who are all meteorologists. Were the convective outlooks slight, moderate, high risk? Was that ever made for the public to read, or were those solely for meteorological use and just for meteorologists?
Yeah. There used to be a phrase, if you look at the convective outlook, that was for internal government use only, or for official use only. The primary audience of the convective outlooks was local weather service forecast offices. It was an internal weather service communication product, and then emergency management officials. It actually, you guys weren't originally on the list of people who were supposed to see the convective outlooks, and obviously. In this, sometime in the mid 90s, as it became available, as the internet began to get wider spread, products started going out. And I think there's still a tension between what that official audience is and the fact that everybody knows that the general public sees the forecast product. But I don't really think there's been much of a change in philosophy of how the outlooks are put out, and how they could be interpreted. And so that's But originally, it was only the inside people who were supposed to see the thing, and there used to be that message, and I can't even. And unfortunately, the message was attached to the outlook, but wasn't officially a part of the outlook. Where I can't even go back now and find out when that message disappeared, because you go back in the archives and it's just not there. But I know it was there into the early 90s.
All right, Harold. Wait, I thought I had some problem with audio. You guys can still hear me, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay, I didn't know. I'm in the conference room here. Okay, I want to go back a little bit to the survivability in a tornado. When I was out surveying damage after May 20th last year, I saw entire toilets that were completely detached and thrown miles from people's homes. But yet, it seems that we like to tell people to get in a bathtub, or hold on to the toilet in your stall of your bathroom. It just seems in some cases that might not necessarily be the best thing to do, but I know that it's something we do tell people. So I don't know. I mean, if you can talk a little bit about that, because when I went out there and I saw bathtubs and I saw toilet bowls down the street, I mean, it was kind of ridiculous.
Well, in the world of violent tornadoes, there are no guarantees.
Right.
Even if you do the right thing, it may not work out very, very well. And honestly, a 1 to 2% death rate, that's a not a very big number in one sense, but it's actually a very large number if you think about it in terms of your ordinary day-to-day life. If you think about what are the chances you're going to die today, most of the time, it's not very high. So 1 to 2% is a really large number compared to normal, but it's a low rate when you look at the absolute big problem at the time. Now, one of the things that we try to tell people is that by doing the right thing, dramatically increase your chances of survival and of not being injured. To where it's not, I can't promise you you're going to make it, but your chances go up a heck of a lot if you do the right thing as opposed to doing the wrong thing. And so the basic messages are: you get as low as you can, you put as many walls between you and the tornado as possible. You want to be in a small interior room. One of the things that's great about bathrooms is that there's pipes in the walls, and the pipes help add to the protection of the structure. There's a lot more stuff going on in the walls than just in an ordinary room. And so, that's, you do that, you go to a small interior closet, and you get as low as you can when you're in there. When they did a survey after the May 3rd '99 tornado, what was left in houses which had only like one small room left in so what we, at least now EF3 damage, what was found was that almost all of the missiles, the 2x4s and things that had penetrated walls of those small rooms, almost all of them penetrated above 3 feet above the ground. It was because essentially stuff that's lower than that has lost energy because it's probably bounced on the ground at some point. And so, yeah, there aren't any guarantees. But interior bathrooms away from windows are a whole lot better place to be than against the outside wall of your house in the living room next to the windows.
And there's been a little bit of discussion as well as about helmets and wearing helmets and then getting into your safe spot. But there are others that also say no, because then people will be searching for minutes for a helmet somewhere, and then, time goes by and the tornado's hitting your house. So, I mean, what do you think about that?
I want a helmet on.
Yeah.
And part of that is you have to think about it before it happens. Just as with many other things in life, if you're waiting till 5 minutes before you have to do something dramatic to find where the bicycle helmet is, that's a problem. When I mentioned that you need to know this morning that, well, today's the day I potentially may need to pay attention to do something that I don't normally do. That's where you make sure you know where the helmets are, and you can get to them in 2 seconds rather than get to them in going into the garage and digging around to try to find them and wasting 5 minutes. You need to know where they are before they happen. You need to know. In our house, we do have the safe room. It's the walk-in closet of our house. What we do is, if the threat starts to get pretty high, one of the things that's in our closet is clothes hampers. They come out of the closet, and I'll put them back in when we're done. There's a shoe rack that comes out of the closet, so we got more room. And then those things go back in whether we use it or not. They go back in. But we do a few things typically before warnings have even been issued in our vicinity, just to make sure that we can get in there in 30 seconds and be settled when we really have to. Have a plan. That's the message. Just like any other threat in life, you're a whole lot better off if you have a plan about what you're going to do when the event happens. If a fire, if you have a fire at your house, what are you going to do? If you have to start thinking when the smoke detectors go off and going, well, gee, I ought to go this way, you're in trouble because you didn't already think about what to do.
Harold, do you think that there's a future? I know that every single home is required to put in a smoke detector. Do you think that somewhere out there will be some type of law passed where every single home needs some type of weather alert, whether it be a weather radio, whether it is a home security system that will alert you? Because it's amazing to me how we live in a world now with so much safety and always making sure that all your I's are dotted and all your T's are crossed, but yet somehow homes, especially out here, are not built without some type of advanced warning system. Do you think there's a future for that?
Well, I'd like to think so, but when I'm honest with myself, I doubt it. I just don't think that's I don't know if it's ever going to be a high enough priority for anybody. I mean, the smoke detectors, part of it is that if you just look at the number of fatalities that occur annually in fires in the United States, it's a lot more than it is in tornadoes. I mean, and just to be somewhat cold, the tornado fatality numbers tend to average around 60 or 70 a year. The fire fatalities are probably a couple of orders of magnitude larger than that, and so that's just a bigger threat. And so it's a lot easier to get action when the threat is much larger. The tornado threat, there are other issues that go on in terms of, we've talked about trying to find ways that that insurance companies might encourage different behaviors in terms of building, but in reality right now, what you pay for the wind component of your homeowner's insurance isn't really all that much, and so they can't really give you that much of a discount to encourage you to do things, to pay things off, whereas with fire, having a fire extinguisher, things like that, the amount that our insurance companies pay out for fires is so large that they're willing to essentially invest in protecting lives and property from fire.
I think it's impressive too, Dr. Brooks. A lot of this technology in some way seems to be kind of snuck in. I mean, the smartphone, I was impressed, just a year or two ago when you're getting these alerts and you didn't even know you had.
Right, yeah. Well, there's a new technology out that I'm not sure exactly what the status of it is nationally. It's been tested in, I think, in Newark and Washington, and I'm now drawing a blank on the acronym for it. But essentially, it uses your cell phone for what it really is, which is it's really a radio. It's not a telephone like you have sitting on your desk. It's actually a radio, and they can essentially broadcast from cell phone towers messages. And right now the technology I think is limited to 90 characters, so it's Twitter light. But that they can essentially broadcast messages for you, and if you're close enough to that tower, you'll get it. If you're not close to any of the towers that are in the danger area, you won't get a message. So when the Weather Service puts out the polygon tornado warnings, in theory, it ought to be able to be set up to where only the cell phone towers within that polygon get alerted, and you can pick up that message as you're going along. And that would be a relatively specific way. And one of the really nice things about that as opposed to, say, reverse 911 calling that alerts people, is that by using it as a radio, you send out one message and you can reach thousands of people. Whereas with reverse 911, you have to make 1,000 phone calls, and that can't happen instantaneously. So that's, I think, something that I'm optimistic about down the road. Now, when is that technology going to improve beyond 90 characters? That's another question. But eventually, you would like to think that it could become a richer source, and that it would provide you some guidance to, I really don't want to get I don't want to get that kind of message. I want to tailor what I've got. I don't really, I don't need to get the message that there's a freeze warning tonight, but I need to get the message of other kinds. And so I'm hoping that essentially the smartphones can be used then to help people tailor exactly the messages that they want and need.
Dr. Brooks, I respond to this one. This was sent to me a lot this week. Truck thrown 27 miles. So I guess this was the Valonia Mayflower tornado. I guess everything you see on the internet just has to be true. Did you hear that one?
Oh yeah, and I actually contacted the USA Today reporter who originally one of the original stories on it, and they've now put up the fact that appears to not be true. That would be getting a truck thrown a couple hundred yards would be a really big deal. 27 miles seemed
a little stretch.
It seems a little stretch. And what I have heard now is that apparently the gentleman whose truck it was, I don't know how you do this. This wouldn't happen with me. But he actually doesn't remember where he left the truck before the tornado.
What?
Okay. Was it in the driveway or was it on the street? Okay, that part I can do. 27 miles. I think I'd remember if I'd left my vehicle in Edmond instead of Norman.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, no kidding. Hey, Harold, one last question I got to ask. With these polygon warnings that we have, is this it, or are you all working, or is there an organization there that is working with trying to change the polygon warnings?
Yeah, there's a lot of there's a group here that's involved in the it's called probabilistic hazard information that we're trying to figure out ways that essentially you can put out high resolution gridded guidance that changes on a few minute basis. One of the real challenges is that those kinds of things is how you turn that product into something that's useful for the wide variety of users. Obviously, people like you that are paying attention to the weather all the time in an event like that, having a constantly updating map might be really, really nice. But my next door neighbor, is she going to check every 5 minutes to see what just got updated on the map? Did my probability of severe weather go from 40% to 45% or 35%? And that's just so much information for the general public to have. But I'm not sure we're going to get to that point. Although I can imagine, again, some sort of app developer producing a time series for you at your location of here's when your biggest threats are based off of that. But that it might well be very useful for the media to see, and you could filter it in some way that's useful for your viewers, for emergency managers to see, for people who have sensitive properties, nursing homes, hospitals, that might, they really need to know earlier perhaps than the general public needs to know. If I'm taking shelter in my house, it takes me a couple of minutes. If I'm trying to move 100 patients out of a nursing home into the safest area in there, that takes a lot longer time. So I need a little bit higher, longer lead time for information, and I may need to start acting at a lower probability of threat than if I'm in my individual house.
So essentially, we're talking about having a probability scale inside of a polygon, and so you would have little lines drawn out saying this area has a 10% chance, this area has a 70% chance. Is that what we're talking about?
That's sort of a conceptual design for it. There's obviously an awful lot of detail that has to go into to make it work. But for instance, the northern part of Norman was in the tornado warning, was in the polygon for 20th tornado. But when the local office drew the polygon, they knew the probability of the tornado coming down to, say, Tecumseh Road in Norman was a lot less than the probability of the tornado going to 4th Street in York. But yet the polygon looks flat. And yeah, you could imagine a physical scenario that would get it down into Norman, but that that wasn't nearly as probable as going through Moore. And so perhaps the local emergency managers would benefit from knowing those kinds of things, and also be able to tell, well, today the peak threat for this storm, the peak threat anywhere is 30%, and last week the peak threat anywhere was 70%. That kind of information might be really useful to a lot of users.
And I have one more thing before we go. The other thing I found interesting, if you guys didn't hear it, I did a story on tornado sirens just a few days ago, and the emergency manager down in Moore told me that they talk to social scientists quite often, and they say that majority of people require 2 ways of getting warnings before they actually take action. And I thought that was pretty interesting because you guys were talking about apps and phone alerts and things like that. So, even if they hear a siren, they might go out and look for a tornado before, oh, I get a text alert now. Okay, now it's really serious. I thought that was really interesting.
And it's also a case of what we refer to as trusted sources. If you go around the country, and I'm not going to talk about you as a station individually, so that we can stay out of any personalities. But one of my
let's do it. Come on now. Come on, Dr. Brooks.
Let's say my in-laws in St. Louis. There's actually something to be said for the fact that, okay, the different TV stations do things a little bit differently, and that perhaps they're more comfortable with one of the affiliates that they view because they know that this guy, I've watched him for 20 years, and I know what he means when he says things, and I can tell when he thinks this is really important and really dangerous. And this other guy, man, I never want to have the TV on when he's on because I don't believe it. And so that's one of those things, is that there may be some sources that people look for multiple sources, but there may be some sources that are trusted sources. If there's a severe weather threat, I get a bunch of my wife's friends where she teaches at school, ask her to ask me what's really going on. And in some sense, what I'm doing mostly is essentially just translating National Weather Service forecast products. Part is I can read between the lines. I can read when the Storm Prediction Center, since I read all of the outlook, when the Storm Prediction Center puts out an outlook, I can tell them, well, the big threat's tornado, the big threat's hail, and I can read the nuances of what they're saying and what they, and in the background of what they mean. And same kind of thing that I suddenly become a trusted source for them, and so they make it more seriously. They'll ask me, well, what should we do with which television station to watch? And I'll give them my opinions on what we do at our house, and they'll go, oh, well, if it's good enough for you, You know, and in reality, what we have on frequently, I like to compare what you and other stations do. So we'll actually, in the course of an evening, if I don't think the threat's real big, we'll bounce around, and I'll try to have I'll have two TVs on different stations in different rooms to be able to hear both of what you're saying, just to compare. That's interesting. They're focusing on this, perhaps a different storm is their primary focus, or they're saying things differently and trying to catch.
It's entertaining, doesn't it?
As long as you're not personally threatened, yes. I mean, that's the thing. Is that when it comes down to, if I think, hey, the tornado is coming real close to my house, and I may actually have to take protective action, my strategies change a little bit. I may have two stations on still, but that's only because, you know, different stations are showing me the radar at different times, and I can look at the radar myself and make my own interpretation of what's going on just as well as I think you guys can. And so, that's one of the things that's important to keep for people to keep in mind is learning to trust people. And that's, I think, a big part of your guys' job is becoming a trusted source of information.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we could talk a lot. Is there anything anyone wants to get in last minute before we end the show?
Good.
No, you're good. So, well, hey, Harold, we certainly appreciate you coming on the show today, and of course, always giving us much needed information and some amazing stats. So, Harold, we will be in touch soon. But again, thanks again for coming on the show today.
Absolutely, and I'd be delighted to do it again at some time in the future.
Excellent.